Now, before we do more with the GDP, it's really important to think through carefully this definition and consider what exactly the GDP measures and doesn't measure. Because it's very tempting, given the way the GDP is used in the news, to think that the GDP is a measure of welfare. And it isn't. So, usually you look at the news, you look at other people, and they say things like the economy is doing well, the economy is doing poorly, the economy is doing great, the economy is going to grow, the economy is not. And what they're usually referring to is the GDP. And indeed, overall, it is pretty important to have a good level of GDP. Because a higher GDP means you're using your resources more efficiently. You don't have unemployed resources at high levels. And we'll come to that when we come to unemployment. Right? But remember the PPF, we said that higher production meant you were on the PPF. So that's something. We also like to have more stuff. More stuff, higher GDP. And we usually think that it's a good thing for people to have more stuff. Now, don't get me wrong. It's not like economists think that more stuff is just everybody having 3 VCRs and 5 TVs or something like that. But, more stuff means things like also more education, better standards of living, more food, more healthcare. There's lots of stuff that we need to live important, meaningful, comfortable lives. It's kind of valuable to have the resources to be able to fund, for example, a national education system or healthcare or something like that. Right? So more stuff. But we also have to be really careful not to think that the GDP by itself is a particularly good measure of welfare. So we're going to start by thinking of some limitations of the GDP, some of which we can address, and some of which can't really be addressed as is by the GDP or with minor tweaks, and which require a deep dive into additional information and data. So here is the first thing to think about. The GDP is a really good measure of all newly produced final goods and services. So the way in which I measure it is that I take the current value of all these products and I add them. The problem is, as I get a higher number for the GDP, it may not reflect more stuff. Because supposing I had 1 pen this year, a pen was worth $1.10. I got 1 pen next year, a pen was worth $2.20, and it looks like I got twice as much stuff. But I still only got 1 pen, right? I got the same amount of stuff. It just looks like more stuff because prices are going up. So because of inflation, nominal, which is this year's prices, GDP is actually not a good measure of growth. In order to get a sense of growth, whether I've actually got more stuff, I need to instead create a new measure that I'm going to call real GDP. The R stands for real. And real GDP is used by really calculating GDP by taking some kind of constant price level to adjust for that. So when we come to inflation and come to price deflators, we're going to talk about how to do nominal versus real. So we can address inflation. We know how to address inflation. There are some controversies because a lot's going to depend on base years and changes in quality and things like that. But these are things economists talk about. And these are things we're aware of. And most economists not only know this, but most economists will not even mention it. They'll take it for granted that you understand that when you measure growth, you will always measure growth in terms of real GDP. So growth is the percentage change in real GDP. Not nominal GDP, real GDP. percentage change in real GDP. What that means is it's this year's GDP minus last year's GDP divided by last year's GDP, always using real GDP numbers. So, okay, that's one issue we can handle. But there are some additional issues that we can't really handle. So the first thing is that the GDP measures production. But it doesn't tell me whether the stuff I'm producing is a good or a bad. I know I say goods and services, and this makes it seem very nice. It's all goods. But when I say goods and services, I just mean stuff. I'm not asking whether you produced pornography or education. I'm not asking whether you produced something that catered to a small number of people, or whether you managed to meet social goals around, say, child welfare and equity. All right? So nothing in my measure actually tells me whether I'm producing goods or bads. And it might be that some of the things we produce are not good. Addictive substances, big money markets. But they're not really that good for the welfare of the people when you have large volume of that in production. Right? So this is one thing to keep in mind, that more GDP, you have to think about what's being produced. So that is the first question. What are we producing? So the types of goods. This is what we call the what to produce question. If you remember your early econ. GDP just tells me you produce the stuff. It doesn't take account of the ecological, environmental, or other impact that producing the stuff has. So if you produce oil, I will count the oil in the GDP. There is no negative or accounting or taking care of the fact that oil could have devastated entire, if it's offshore drilling, entire marine ecologies, right? So there's actually no attention in the GDP to ecological devastation. In fact, things that are terrible for the environment can look great for growth. You chop that Brazilian rainforest down. That is huge logging money, huge growth, right? It's too easy to imagine that just because it's a bigger number, just because GDP, economists have proved that this is what we need to do, it's good. That's not true. We all understand that this is all this measure is. That's all it's supposed to measure. So we also need to think about how the goods are produced. What is the ecological footprint of this? Is it using child labor? Things like that, right? So remember, what to produce, how to produce. GDP doesn't pay attention to that. It just looks at how much you produced, right? The GDP also is a total number. So it doesn't tell me who gets the stuff. It is not a good measure of distribution. So for example, if I have one society in which one guy gets $1,000 and the other guy gets $10, that's 1,010, that's my GDP. And I've got another society where one guy's got $300, the other guy's got $710. That's also 1,010. And it's all the same, right? But we might decide that those are very different types of societies in terms of decision making, social power, equity, questions like that. So we're actually going to have to take some time to think through questions of distribution. And there is the GDP can't help us do that. So we're going to actually look separately at measures. We're going to have, and economists do this, measures of income distribution. So just as I have measures of inflation, I have measures of income distribution. So, but remember, just because I've got more stuff doesn't mean it's better unless I know who's getting it, how it was produced, what exactly I'm producing. And finally, but not the least, the GDP also does not pay attention to non-market production. So what this means is entire areas of human life, in particular the unpaid labor of women and the work of child rearing and child caring, is completely absent from the GDP. This is important because if you build an entire budget and taxation system around the idea that what has economic value is what promotes GDP, by definition, anything you leave out of the GDP is viewed as wasteful, not needed, inessential, not that great for the economy, bad for growth. And the problem is you're taking for granted that this measure was actually designed to think about whether or not what we did was good for our well-being or the economy, right? And the answer is, since it was not designed to do that, it's not going to be the measure you want to use when you're making policy decisions of certain kinds, right? So it doesn't include unpaid labor. So it's not a good way to think about who actually contributed to social well-being and who deserves to get a share of the things we produce. It doesn't pay attention to whether we've got goods or bads. It doesn't actually pay attention to how goods are produced or what the technological footprints and ecological footprints are. It doesn't pay good attention to the distribution of the product in terms of who actually got the stuff that was all produced. All it does is it measures how much we produced. So keep that in mind. It is not a good measure of welfare. In fact, there is an entire field of economics that looks at measurement, welfare, well-being. And so, for example, economists look at all kinds of other ways to measure those things because the GDP is not good at it. You have the Human Development Index. You have the Gender Development Index. You have the Environmental Impact Index. There's a whole bunch of ways in which we measure them, not through the GDP. That said, the GDP is important. Tells us how much we're producing, and it is always important to remember that production and participating in monetary production is the way in which majority of people in the world today, especially in our country, this is how they access goods and services and earn a living. So never underestimate the value of the GDP, but don't overestimate it.